Okay, we're going to build off our last lecture and talk a little bit more about soil and plant relationships. This is, in many ways, kind of a continuation framing the course and what we'll really be discussing over the semester. So let's get started here. And really, when we think about soil fertility, most of that is in the context of plant nutrient uptake. We're aware that plants acquire nutrients from air, soil, and water, so essentially all three of the spheres of the earth. CO2 is absorbed by the leaves via stomates, and CO2 or oxygen enters through roots as components of H2O, right? And we talked last time about plants really being primarily made up of carbon dioxide, oxygen, and water. That's really what goes into the vast majority of the plant. What we're going to be talking about for actually really most of this course is kind of these other bits, right? The small pieces to this, and those are the ions and the nutrients. So most soil nutrients are absorbed by the roots, okay? So plants get nutrients primarily through the roots. Minerals in rainwater and foliar fertilizer may also enter the leaves. We'll talk more about this as we get there, but there's a push by a lot of folks selling products in the fertilizer industry for foliar fertilization. There are times when that makes perfect sense, but there's times when it makes absolutely no sense because plants have evolved not to take up nutrients through their leaves primarily, but through their roots. And so really, root uptake of nutrients, of ions, is the primary mechanism that plants acquire these essential nutrients, okay? And so respiration through gas exchange, CO2 enters and O2 exits, right? So this is what we were talking about. CO2 plus water plus energy at the side of this leaf, right, is where the magic happens, really the basis of life on Earth. We're reducing carbon into some sort of simple carbohydrate, some sort of simple sugar, then oxygen is produced. And collectively, it's carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen that form the kind of the structural basis of all plant life, okay? And so whether we're talking about corn stover or, the wood in, say, a redwood tree at the bole of a tree, carbon, oxygen, hydrogen come from CO2 and H2O into photosynthesis, okay? And so not that the process is that simple and it ends right there. Of course, there's lots and lots of biochemistry that happens in plants. A myriad of carbon compounds, reduced carbon compounds, starting with ribose, glucose, fructose, etc., lots of simple sugars that get built into long chains. But this is the building blocks, really, of life, of all plant life, okay? And there's really sophisticated ways that plants take up nutrients, and they primarily, again, do this through the roots, right? And so roots, there's great textbooks and studies of roots. We're not going to dive too deep into roots in this course, but roots and plants have lots of different mechanisms for root morphology and physiology. But a fundamental feature of roots is that there's kind of this branching that happens. So a primary root, a secondary root, tertiary roots, and then at some point, root hairs develop. And these root hairs really exponentially increase the surface area of the root itself. And so plants are able to explore a lot more of the soil. Of course, we can talk about mycorrhizal fungi kind of aiding in this, and other components of the rhizosphere aiding in the ability of roots to explore the soil space. But these root hairs play a critical role in terms of mineral nutrient uptake, that is, nutrients taken up from the soil into the plants. Soil is, an interesting beast, and there's a lot of different varieties out there, a lot of different, essentially, types or species of soil that are out there. Um, in a general sense, we can say that soil is mostly is half something and half nothing, right? So roughly half, and of course this is a gross generalization, but maybe half of soil is in solid phase, maybe a quarter in air phase, a quarter in water phase at any given time. In a saturated situation, water occupies a much greater fraction, and when in a drought situation, air would occupy a much greater fraction. But maybe 45% of that total volume is mineral particles, essentially sand, silt, and clay. And then we've got a small fraction that would be considered the organic fraction. So that could be organic matter, could be roots, it could be actually microbiology, so the microbiota of bacteria, fungi, archaea, et cetera, and then all the mesofauna, the nematodes, and the springtails, and all the earthworms, all the goodies that are out there. But you can see in general, soil is really, there's not a lot of organics that are in soil. I mean, in terms of a volume basis, it's a pretty small percentage. Okay, so but it plays a large role, and that's kind of the point. So I'm going to talk a little bit about nutrient supply to plant roots. Okay, and this is, in lots of ways, this diagram is, or the picture itself isn't particularly that inspiring, but there's a lot that's happened here, and just conceptually, it's important just to kind of, it's like throwing a bunch of balls in the air and trying to jug them all, just keeping them all in your mind in terms of what is happening and in the soil, and then how it's like all these factors that influence actual nutrient supply and uptake. So when we talk about nutrients, we talk about ions. Those are the same things. Nutrients essentially are ions. Okay, they're simple molecular pieces that plants actually take up from the soil, and it's really from the soil solution. Okay, and so the importance of each one of these pieces, and we're gonna break these down in here in just a second, but it depends on the actual nutrient. So depending on the nutrient, things like nitrogen, phosphorus, and nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur are microbially driven processes. Okay, and then other things like calcium, magnesium, and potassium really have a much greater they're much more influenced by that mineral component of soil. So we can think of soil really in the context, if we want to dichotomize it, in kind of like the organic or the biological piece, as well as maybe a mineral piece that might be over here. Okay, so in many ways, as if we think about as managers, we're really interested in is that soil going to be able to provide nutrients to that plant or that crop or whatever it is over the course of a season. Okay, and in many ways that is going to depend on what's the ability of that soil to supply a nutrient is going to depend on what the soil solution of that nutrient is. And it's not just nitrogen, it's not just phosphorus or sulfur, it's all those elements that all the elements that plants need in terms of functioning. Okay, and so each one of these elements, as I just indicated, is a little bit different and is influenced by different things. But conceptually, let's talk about some of the pieces that are here. Okay, so as plants absorb nutrients from the soil solution, right, they're taking it up essentially from the soil solution. That is nothing more than water that's in the soil, and so that could be in the macropore space. It could be in maybe some of these more smaller pore spaces or micropores, or even water that's fixed kind of on the surface of the minerals. And so it's all the same stuff. It's just in different forms in terms of the soil moisture at any given time in a field. So As plant roots absorb nutrients from the solution, again, they're taking it from the soil solution, that's designated as number 1 here. They release ions, hydrogen, OH, CH, HCO3, back into the soil solution, okay? So they do this when they're taking things up, they're constantly releasing mostly acids into the soil, and they do this to maintain electrical neutrality, or they need to maintain for biochemical processes for the cell walls in the roots itself. They have to release this to remain neutral. Okay. Otherwise, the osmotic potential and everything goes to whack. So they do this to kind of maintain a balance of sorts. As plant roots absorb nutrients concentrations in the soil decrease, right? So that's not surprising. If a plant is taking up calcium from the soil solution and releasing, say, hydrogen to remain neutral, that calcium concentration in the soil decreases. And so some soils or some nutrients are desorbed or released from clay mineral exchange sites. So things like calcium here, this is represented by number 3. So it's this process of desorption from exchange sites on the mineral surface, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this here in a bit. But that's a really, really important process for nutrient exchange from the soil surface, the soil colloid, these exchange sites into the solution, and then ultimately up into the plant tissue. Okay, so some ions remain in solution while some are adsorbed. Instead of absorb, we're talking about adsorbed. In other words, they're bound to surfaces. So things are essentially coming out, they're precipitating out, or they're essentially, it's not a true precipitation, but it's essentially coming out of solution and into the exchange site. Okay, and we're putting things in nice, neat boxes here, but the reality is that this is really very spatially integrated, and some of these definitions are more concepts than actual, physical locations. So suffice it to say, we're talking about 3 and 4 here. We're having ions that are released from the exchange sites or bound to the exchange sites. Okay, and then some ions remain in solution. And some can actually either precipitate out, and so this is represented as number 5 here, so an actual precipitation or dissolving. And so the difference between 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 are if that ion is essentially keeping in the same form, or if it's actually interacting with other minerals, other atoms, and actually changing conformational shape, right? So is it coming from is it calcium that's in solution, or is it calcium that's interacting, say, with a calcium phosphate that's coming in and out of actually that mineral form? And so we can think about this side over here is really just becoming available and unavailable, and there's different mechanisms for that. Okay, so again, we call this a precipitation and a dissolution, 5 and 6 respectively. Okay, so then we've got this whole kind of organic component, and we can draw a box around this in terms of organic matter and microorganisms. So microorganisms degrade soil, plant residue, and organic matter by excreting extracellular enzymes. These enzymes mineralize or release nutrients into solution. And that's number 8. So this process of mineralization is really turning things from the organic fraction, releasing them into the inorganic or more simple fraction into the soil solution. So that's number 8. And then conversely, they can be microorganisms and are constantly taking up nutrients. They need nutrients to grow and survive, and just like plants do. And so that process, number 7, is called immobilization. So mineralization and immobilization are essentially they're the reaction that runs in opposite directions, okay? And so it's a process of microorganisms releasing nutrients or taking them up and mobilizing, i.e. embodying them into their tissue, okay? And so, of course, we really like when microbes take up nutrients and excrete nutrients because it helps stimulate nitrogen cycling and makes, in a managed ag context, it makes the plant productivity typically increases. So it makes for a more productive soil, more fertile, healthy soil, okay? All right, we're almost there. Plant roots and microorganisms use oxygen and CO2 through metabolic activities. Those are respired and consumed. And this is really that soil, air, so the soil solution atmospheric exchange that occurs here, okay? So that occurs not just, say, above ground, but it also, there's lots of air that's in soil. And, as microbes are in there decomposing organic matter, they're releasing CO2, and that CO2 is enriching the pockets of air that exchange in soil, and that CO2 might absorb back in. There's lots of things that happen in that regard, okay? And then finally, there's numerous environmental factors, human activities, etc., that all influence if the soil solution, like how much is it actually staying stationary in the soil? Is it flowing through? So, if you're irrigating, for example, water is getting added to that system, and if it's saturated, it's starting to push water down and move through the system. It could be irrigation, it just could be rainfall, but we're often getting losses, nutrients leaching out of the soil profile via the soil solution. They're dissolved in the soil solution, and that water essentially gets flushed, whether that be rainfall or irrigation. If there's not a lot of rainfall or irrigation and evapotranspiration, so there's plenty of instances in the summertime when water is essentially moving upward from lower levels in the profile to higher levels because of this evapotranspiration. So suffice it to say, there's a lot of management and environmental factors that influence kind of the overall dynamics here. So this is really kind of a long-winded way of saying that nutrient dynamics and nutrient acquisition, ion exchange in soil, in other words, what is in the soil solution at any given time is influenced by a lot of different factors. And so these are factors that we're going to kind of dive into over the course of the semester and talk about this. But you can see that it's a complex system, and it's the complexity that makes it challenging to manage. It makes it a bit, it introduces a fair amount of uncertainty, especially when you introduce things like microorganisms, things like, unpredictable and unmanageable things like rainfall, for example, especially in wet places like Ohio. So it's a challenge, but it's all part of the process. Is all part of the whole story here in terms of determining nutrient availability to plants.